There are moments when life grows strangely quiet, not because nothing is happening, but because something deep within you has already begun to change. Long before the world reveals a new path, the soul has already started walking toward it. Have you ever felt a shift before you could name it? A heaviness settling somewhere behind the sternum, an inexplicable restlessness that arrives on an ordinary afternoon for no reason you can point to, as if something in you had already received news the rest of you had not yet heard. Have you ever watched a friendship, or a situation, or a season of your life, and felt, beneath all the reassurances you were offering yourself, that you already knew how this was going to end? And what if that quiet knowing was not anxiety at all, not the nervous system misfiring, not imagination running ahead of evidence, but something older than any of that, a deeper faculty of the mind, one that has always seen before the eyes do, and has simply been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for you to stop explaining it away? Carl Jung spent the better part of his life taking that question seriously, at a time when serious people were not supposed to. What he found, not through mysticism, but through decades of clinical observation, through the slow accumulation of what his patients dreamed, feared, and sensed without being able to say why, was that the conscious mind is not the whole of the mind. It is, in his framing, the surface. Beneath it runs something vast and old, a layer of psychological life he called the unconscious, and its defining quality is that it does not wait for your permission. It processes what the conscious mind refuses to hold. It works while you sleep, while you speak, while you sit across a table from someone and feel, without any articulable reason, that something between you has already shifted. Jung did not romanticize this. He was precise about it. The unconscious is not a mystical organ of prophecy. It is a structural feature of the psyche, the part of you that has been gathering information from your environment, from your body, from the pattern of how things have moved before, long before the part of you that narrates your life has caught up. It speaks in the language available to it. Dreams, sometimes. Bodily unease, the chest that tightens in a room before you understand why, the sleep that becomes ragged 3 nights before the phone call arrives. And sometimes it speaks in what feels like sourceless certainty, the knowledge that arrives whole, without steps, without evidence you could present to anyone, and that you immediately begin to argue yourself out of because it arrived without a receipt. Here is the uncomfortable cost of living close to that intelligence. To hear it, you must first stop filling every silence. And silence, for most of us, has become the one thing we cannot bear. We have built an entire civilization of noise, not because we are shallow, but because we are afraid of what surfaces when the noise stops. The unconscious does not shout. It has no need to. It has been present since before you learned to speak. It is simply waiting for you to stop talking long enough to listen. Imagine a river at the edge of a village, a wide, slow river that the oldest inhabitants knew how to read. Not by any instrument, not by any method they could fully explain to a stranger, but by attention accumulated over years. 3 days before the flood, the river changed color, not dramatically, a slight deepening at the edges, a heaviness in the current that a passing traveler would never notice. But the village had learned to look. They would see it on a Tuesday, and by Friday the preparations were finished, the animals moved, the lowest stores carried to higher ground. The flood would come. The damage would be held. Then, over generations, they forgot. Not all at once, slowly, the way important things are always forgotten. The elders who had watched the water died, and the knowledge was not passed on precisely, and eventually it was spoken of as superstition. And then the engineers came, and the engineers built walls. Thick, confident walls that stood between the village and the river, walls that made the river invisible from the windows. The village felt safer. It no longer had to watch the water, and the first time the flood exceeded the walls, the village was entirely unprepared, because they had not merely forgotten the signal. They had built a structure specifically designed so they would never have to see it. Perhaps you recognize something in that. The signal was always there. It was always in the water. What changed was not the river's willingness to speak. What changed was your willingness to look at it. And perhaps more than that, the walls you built, the explanations and the rationalizations and the constant forward motion of a life kept deliberately busy. Perhaps those were never really about safety. Perhaps they were about not having to know. And so the question becomes, when did you learn to distrust the water? Because it was learned. That is the part worth sitting with. You were not born dismissing your own perception. There was a time, perhaps very early, when you felt something shift in a room and you named it, to a parent, to a friend, to someone you trusted, and the response that came back taught you something. Not through cruelty necessarily. Sometimes through impatience. Sometimes through the particular silence of someone who needed you not to see what you were seeing. You're imagining things. You're being too sensitive. That's not what happened. Said often enough. Said by the right people at the right moment. Those phrases do not merely correct an observation. They restructure the observer. They teach you that your inner instrument is unreliable, that your readings are to be checked against external consensus before they can be trusted, that humility, real humility, the kind that makes you easier to be around, means deferring to someone else's account of reality over your own. And so you deferred. You became very good at it. What you called being open-minded was sometimes something quieter and more painful than that. It was the habit of editing your own perception before it could fully form, not considering other viewpoints, erasing your own before it could inconvenience anyone. The feeling would arrive, whole and specific and certain, and before it could draw a full breath, you were already building the case against it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm projecting. Maybe I'm making this about me. And underneath all of that reasonable-sounding self-correction was something Jung would have recognized immediately. Not humility, but a kind of trained abandonment of the self. Jung's understanding of the shadow is relevant here, and it is more precise than people usually allow. The shadow is not simply the darkness in you, the anger, the envy, the grief you consider unacceptable. It is anything the psyche has decided it cannot hold in the light of consciousness. And what cannot be held does not disappear. It is displaced. It goes underground, and it finds other exits. Sometimes it projects outward. You experience your own unnamed fear as a sudden, irrational distrust of someone else. Sometimes it resurfaces as the body's wordless knowledge, the tightening in the chest before you've processed why, the sleep that won't come the night before a conversation you haven't yet admitted you're dreading. And sometimes it arrives as premonition, as that 3-day warning you dismissed as irrational, as anxiety, as the neurosis of an overthinking mind. Imagine a woman who keeps a garden. She has tended it for years, and she knows it the way you know a language you grew up speaking, not by consulting rules but by feel. One morning she walks out and something is wrong. She cannot say what. The light is the same. The soil looks the same. The plants have not visibly changed. But something in her, the accumulated intimacy of years, registers a dissonance before her eyes can locate it. She almost dismisses it. She has things to do. She has learned, somewhere along the way, that this kind of feeling is unreliable, that acting on it makes her seem anxious, overcautious, the kind of person who sees problems before they exist. So she notes the feeling, and she goes inside. 3 days later, she finds that a root system has been quietly failing, invisible from the surface, and what could have been addressed with patience has now cost her more than she wanted to lose. The garden was trying to speak to her in the only language it had, not in words, not in visible signs, but in the particular texture of wrongness that only years of attention can learn to read. And she had learned that language. She simply no longer trusted herself to speak it. That is what was taken from you, perhaps. Not the signal, the permission to receive it. How many times did you know, not suspect, not wonder, but know, and then construct an argument against your own knowing, thorough enough to convince yourself? How many times did the feeling arrive quietly, on an ordinary afternoon, specific and sourceless and insistent, and you answered it with reason, with fairness, with the generous interpretation, with the voice that said you had no evidence, that you could not be certain, that it would be wrong to act on a feeling. How many times did you give the benefit of the doubt, not because the doubt was genuinely there, but because doubt had become the socially acceptable container for a certainty you had no permission to hold? How many times did you stand in the rubble of something you had already grieved, and only then allow yourself to say, I knew before any of this. I knew when there was still time. There is a word worth sitting with here, not premonition. That word carries too much of the mystical, too much of the candle and the closed eye. The word is reception. The question has never been whether the signal was sent. The question is whether you allowed yourself to receive it. Perhaps what you called bad intuition was not intuition failing at all. It was intuition arriving correctly, precise, early, addressed to you, and the conscious mind refusing delivery. The premonition was not wrong. You were simply taught, somewhere along the way, to be a poor recipient of your own inner mail. Taught that the feeling needed a certificate before it could be opened. Taught that certainty required an external witness, and so the letters piled up. And so you called the pile anxiety, or sensitivity, or irrational fear, and you were polite to it and put it in a drawer and kept moving. Jung understood this refusal as something more structural than a bad habit. The unconscious, he observed, holds what the conscious mind cannot yet afford to know. It is not that you lacked the intelligence to understand what was happening. It is that understanding it would have required you to act, and acting would have required you to let go of something you were not yet ready to release. A version of a relationship, a story about a person you loved, a belief about yourself as someone who does not abandon, does not overreact, does not make something out of nothing. The knowing was not buried because it was wrong. It was buried because it was expensive. And here, Arthur Schopenhauer offers something worth pausing over. Schopenhauer wrote of what he called will. Not will as conscious intention, but will as the blind, driving force that moves beneath every thought you have, beneath every preference and fear and attachment, the vast subterranean current that carries you before you know where you are going. This will, he argued, knows the shape of things before reason has assembled the evidence. Not because it is prophetic, but because it is intimate. It has access to patterns your conscious mind is too busy to track. The slight shift in another person's timing, the almost imperceptible change in the texture of a silence, the way a room feels different before anyone has said a word. Your reason takes these details and files them as inconclusive. Your will has already drawn its conclusion. This is not magic. It is pattern recognition operating below the threshold of articulable thought, surfacing as feeling before it can be dressed as argument. The body knows, because the body has been paying attention at a level the mind finds difficult to reach. Schopenhauer was not describing supernatural knowledge. He was describing a more ancient and uninterrupted form of attention, one that has always been there, working, cataloging, reading the room, one that the noise of modern self-doubt has made nearly impossible to hear. Imagine a clockmaker who had spent 40 years with the same mechanisms. Not a talented man by any dramatic measure, patient mostly, quiet by choice. He would take a watch in his hand on a Monday and set it back down and say, without opening the case, that it would stop by Thursday. Not every time, but enough times that his apprentices stopped questioning it. They asked him once how he knew. He said he did not know. He said that he listened, and that silence and sound told him different things, and that a mechanism beginning to fail had a quality he could not translate into words, only into a feeling in the fingers, a register of wrongness too fine for language. He had spent long enough in intimacy with the machine that the machine had, in some sense, begun to speak to him in a frequency below speech. You have been living inside yourself longer than he had been with any watch. You have been inside this body, behind these eyes, through every version of every room you have ever sat in. You have more data about yourself, about the people you love, about the patterns that repeat, about the specific atmosphere that precedes specific outcomes, than any instrument could hold. The capacity the clockmaker developed through 40 years of attention, you have been developing your entire life. The question is not whether the faculty is there. The question is whether you will go quiet enough to hear it. There is a pattern forming in your mind right now. A face, perhaps, or a situation. Something you have been circling without quite landing on it. You recognize the texture of that texture because you have felt it before. Not once, many times. The specific weight of something approaching that you cannot yet name. The way a room changes temperature before anyone has spoken the word that will change everything. You know this feeling. And perhaps what matters now is not whether you can predict what comes next, but whether you are willing to stop calling that knowledge a coincidence. There is something Carl Jung observed about the way the psyche holds what the conscious mind cannot yet bear to carry. He called it, in part, the compensatory function of the unconscious, the idea that when awareness tips too far in one direction, something beneath it quietly corrects, not through argument, not through reason, through feeling, through the body tightening around a truth the mouth has not yet spoken. The unconscious is not trying to frighten you, it is trying to complete you, and perhaps what you have been calling dread was never dread at all. Perhaps it was the psyche doing its oldest, most faithful work, offering up what the daylight mind keeps filing away. Certainty silences, attention listens. That distinction is worth sitting with. Certainty is the posture of a mind that has already decided. It is efficient, clean, and entirely closed. Attention is something older and slower. It does not arrive with conclusions, it arrives with questions, with a willingness to be changed by what it finds. The clockmaker did not know the watch was failing because he had decided it was. He knew because he had kept himself open to what the watch was telling him, day after day, until the two of them, man and mechanism, had developed something that almost resembled a conversation. That is not mysticism. That is what happens when you refuse to stop listening. And the tragedy of modern life, the particular grief of the kind of person who finds their way to a reflection like this one, is that somewhere along the way, you were taught that certainty was the more sophisticated position. That knowing was only real if it could be explained. That the feeling which arrived on a quiet afternoon, sourceless and complete, was a symptom of something rather than a signal from something. So you practiced certainty. You got very good at it. And in getting good at it, you got further from the one intelligence that had never once lied to you. Imagine a woman who inherits her grandmother's garden. The grandmother had tended it for 50 years, and in that time she had learned things about the soil that no book contained. Which corner grew cold first? Which patch needed water 3 days before the sky gave any sign of rain? Where the frost would arrive before the thermometer agreed. The woman, trained in efficiency, pulls up the grandmother's irregular plantings and lays down a clean, rational grid. The garden looks better, for a season. Then things begin to die in ways she cannot explain, because she has replaced accumulated intimacy with legible order. The knowledge did not disappear. It was in the soil, patient, waiting, but she had stopped being in conversation with it. That garden is the relationship you have with yourself, and the grandmother's knowledge, that felt, embodied, unverifiable but accurate knowing, is the faculty you are in the process of recovering, not building from nothing, recovering. It was always there. It simply required that you value it enough to tend it. The faculty you are recovering is not prediction, it is presence. That matters, because prediction implies control, implies a kind of power over what happens next, and that is not what this is. This is something quieter and more fundamental, the ability to be honestly present with what is already true, before the world has gotten around to confirming it in language you can repeat to someone else. Jung's individuation process, that long, sometimes painful movement toward becoming more fully yourself, is in many ways the process of learning to trust precisely this, of learning that the psyche's signals are not noise to be managed, but information to be received, of understanding that the parts of you that knew and were silenced are not damaged, they are waiting. The slow, patient return to trusting the intelligence that has always lived in you. The one you abandoned, not out of weakness, but out of a very human desire to be easier to be around, to doubt yourself loudly enough that no one else had to do it for you. That was the cost of belonging, and perhaps you paid it for long enough. Perhaps what you are practicing now, in this quieter chapter, is the very different art of belonging to yourself first. So let the reflection rest here, for just a moment, before it asks one last thing of you. You have been living with a question longer than you realized, not the question of whether your premonitions were real, but the deeper one beneath it, whether they are real. Whether the part of you that senses and trembles and knows before it can explain itself deserves to be taken seriously. Whether the intelligence that lives below your words is trustworthy, or whether it is just the noise of a mind too anxious to be still. Perhaps you already know the answer to that, and perhaps that is the question worth carrying out of this room and into the rest of your week, not as a burden, but as a compass. What is the thing you already know that you have not yet allowed yourself to know you know? Not the thing you suspect, not the thing you fear, the thing that arrived quietly, weeks or months ago, that you placed in a drawer and covered with busyness, with other people's opinions, with the much safer project of doubting yourself. It is still in the drawer. It has been patient. And whenever you are ready, not today, not on anyone's schedule but your own, it will still be there, waiting to be received. I want to say something briefly and personally before we close. There was a period in my own life when I was extraordinarily good at explaining away what I felt. I had reasons for everything. I had frameworks. I had alternative interpretations. I had the kind of intellectual flexibility that could turn any premonition into a cognitive distortion and any certainty into arrogance. I thought I was being rigorous. What I was actually doing was keeping myself manageable, for myself more than for anyone else. And then something I had known for almost a year finally arrived in the form I had been refusing to let it take, and I sat with it, not with the shock of surprise, but with the strange, exhausted tenderness of recognizing something you have been looking at for a long time without seeing. I do not tell you this as confession. I tell you because I suspect you know exactly what that exhaustion feels like, and I am glad you stayed until the end of this one. It means something. If the pattern we have been tracing today feels familiar, if there is something specific you have been circling without landing on, the video in the pinned comment goes further. It maps the psychological mechanism behind that circling, the reason the same knowing keeps returning in different shapes. It is worth your time. The link is below, or the code is on screen now. And if something in this reflection landed for you, if you felt, even once, the particular quiet of being accurately described, I would like to ask you something small. Write in the comments just this: I already knew. Nothing more is needed. No explanation, no context. Those 3 words are a form of self-recognition, and they belong to you. If you would like to stay close to this kind of reflection, to have it find you when you need it, rather than when you remember to look, subscribing is how you do that. And I promise the algorithm is far less wise about timing than your unconscious is. Letting the channel come to you is probably the more efficient arrangement. The video appearing on screen now takes everything we have touched here one layer deeper. If this one opened a door, that one walks through it. I think you are ready for it.